what I remember is more the physical experience. I remember, like, how I was navigating the space. I remember like, but I don't remember, like, what I was seeing. I don't really feel like I was having, like, hallucinations or anything. It was just more that, like I said, think this feeling of, like, all this emotional things coming to the surface, almost like a gunk coming up.
What if I told you that you are not too much and you are definitely not broken? You're just living in a world that is constantly disrespecting your peace. Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Be Well Sis podcast. I am your host, Dr. Cassandra Dunbar. How has life been treating you? But more importantly, how have you been treating yourself? On this episode of the podcast, we are joined by the brilliant NK, who is the host of the Basket Case podcast, for a conversation that is so freeing. We talk about what it really means to care for your mental health in a world that tells you just to go ahead and push through. She shares her journey with anxiety, the move to Mexico that changed everything, and how storytelling became her release. So if you've been feeling off, if you've been feeling constantly overstimulated, just know that it is not you, it is the environment that may be out of alignment. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or maybe something a little bit stronger. We do not judge here, and let's get into it. As always, thank you so much for joining. I am so glad you're here. Be well, sis. So I saw that you live in Mexico.
Yeah.
If you want to touch on that really quickly, if you feel comfortable, when did you transition to living out there, and just how
Mhm.
have things been considering our current political climate?
Yeah, and please cut me off if I if I go on too long about it. Yeah, I moved here, let me think. I think this is my two-year anniversary coming up in April.
Nice.
Yeah, and so I made that decision in 2022 or so, up until 2022, I'd spent the last 15 years living in Los Angeles. I was living in Los Angeles when the pandemic started,
Hmm.
and I was living in LA in 2020 when my mom got sick with cancer. And
Oh,
so I wound
wow.
up going home to the South in Tennessee and spending 9 months living at home. Um, my mom passed away, so both, like, the pandemic and my mom's
Sorry.
death were huge, obviously, turning points in my life. There's a
Yeah.
stark before and after. And I
Yeah.
was already sort of thinking about leaving LA before that, but once went home and spent those 9 months in Tennessee, when I went back to the city, I felt like this just doesn't this energetically isn't resonating with me anymore, and I really didn't wanna be there. And so I spent, like, a couple of years looking for a place to live in the US, tried out a bunch of different cities, thought about going back to the South, lived in North Carolina for a summer, and just, like, no place really felt right. And then the
Mhm.
woman that I was dating at the time, told me she also was trying to leave LA when we met, suggested that we move to Mexico City, or she said, like, "Let's go to Mexico City and check it out." She had always wanted to live there. I actually had this, like, long love affair with Mexico. I started coming here in 2008, like, right after I graduated from college, and I've just always really appreciated the culture. I've always really felt at home here,
Mhm.
learned to speak Spanish here when I was in my 20s. And so but that being said, I was kind of like, I feel like I'm trying to leave the city. I can't imagine myself moving to Mexico City. It's like an even bigger city than Los Angeles.
Right.
But I'll go with you. I'll check it out. But, I spent so much time thinking about where I wanted to move that when I came here to visit, I saw that the culture really did have a lot of the things I was looking for. Like, there is the community that I live in, like, a small community within this huge city.
Mhm.
It has sort of small town vibes. I know my neighbors. I get to shop at a local produce market. I see people regularly. That's not an experience I've ever had in the US,
Yeah.
living in New York and LA.
Yeah.
So, um, not only that, but, obviously having public transportation, getting to ride my bike all the time. I just feel like I have access to much better food. And then I also just, like, really love the culture here is also really communal
Mhm.
and sort of it is very community oriented, and I really felt that, and
Mhm.
I really wanted to be influenced by the culture.
Mhm.
And so that was another reason that at the end of that month, our exploratory month, that I decided, like, actually, I could see myself,
Nice.
living here, yeah. And then I don't maybe fewer than 6 months later, we had moved. So,
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
So you're in Mexico City still?
Mhm.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Haven't visited Mexico City yet, but that is very
Okay.
high on my list. Every time I go to Mexico, it's like to like the Riviera Maya area.
Okay, mhm.
But yeah, I want to venture out. I keep seeing that it's a huge like foodie city. And of course, there's a
Yeah.
ton of like just culture in terms of like
Uh-huh.
architecture and
Yeah.
beautiful libraries. I need to get out there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I am jealous. I'm high
Hit
key
me up
jealous
when
of
you're in
you.
town.
I will. I'll hold you
I'm
to
like, "No need
it.
to be jealous, just come on down."
So I would love to talk about Basket Case. What inspired this project?
Mhm. Yeah. Basket Case is a really collaboration between myself and, Jasmine JT Green, who runs a company called Molten Heart. She approached me in 2020, because I had just released an audio memoir called Divesting from People Pleasing.
Mhm,
That was one of the first, like, big audio pieces I ever made, and it was really me documenting as I mentioned, I feel like I started my, like I look back now and I say, like, I feel like was starting my healing journey, like, not long before that, maybe, like, 3 or 4 years before that.
mhm,
And that process was, as is often the case, like, was extremely painful, extremely anxiety inducing, like, basically when I started sort of trying to take steps in my life towards being my authentic self and kind of shedding the things that I feel like were given to me, like, things that I thought were my personality, but things that really weren't mine,
yep,
and started really, like, kinda wading through all those things that happened to me growing up that I had not really dealt with until my early 30s. It also kind of, like, opened the door for a ton of, self-loathing and anxiety, and so I was,
mhm,
like, really swimming in those some of these feelings for a couple of years, and just started kind of documenting. I was, like, kind of making voice memos, I was sort of just talking to myself on the mic a lot, and some of those recordings and some writing and some interviews kinda all came together into this project called Divesting from People Pleasing that was just, like, yeah, this really raw document of that time. So that had just come out, and so after that came out, Jasmine approached me and she said, "I have this idea for a show called Basket Case, and I think you might be a good host for it. Are you interested?" And because I just had finished that audio piece, I was like, "Yeah, I'm definitely interested in talking about it." And so, a couple of years have passed. The show just came out last year, but, really her idea was the name Basket Case. She had that idea when she approached me, was really to talk about the ways that, um, the world that we live in is, like, what creates our feelings of mental distress or mental illness in some
mhm,
cases. The name Basket Case, I really when I started looking into, like, what that name meant, I realized that I really identify with it because the name Basket Case comes from it's a slur from World War One where
mm.
soldiers fighting in World War One would lose all of their limbs. They were called derogatorily, obviously, basket cases because they
Oh,
had to be carried in
wow.
basket. And then over time, that name came to be then to kind of mean someone who is too nervous, too anxious, too fragile to function in society, and so that's
Mhm,
kind of we really were playing off of that, just sort of like, you're too nervous to function inside capitalism, you're too, like you can't function
mhm.
inside white supremacy, you can't function inside these systems that really aren't even designed for us to function in the first place. They're not
That part.
designed for us to feel well, they're not designed for us to feel good,
Yep.
and so it's really talking about, yeah, this idea that, like, health itself also is, socially constructed, and that health is related to your usefulness, to go
Mhm.
back to that first definition, that if you, aren't really useful inside capitalism, then you get called a basket case.
Yep.
Um, so that really resonated with me as someone who I did feel like I said, like, the season of my, like, I do consider myself to have been, like, mentally ill at that time. I don't feel that
Mhm,
way now,
mhm.
but just, like, the extent of my anxiety and self-loathing was so intense and debilitating that I think of it that way. But I also think that, like, those things were about me being a Black woman and having to live in this culture.
I have a
Yeah.
question. So when you
Mhm.
were, I guess, unintentionally, like, creating your audio project, divesting from
Mhm.
people pleasing, at
Yeah.
that time, were you already living in Mexico, or was it like a okay, it
Yeah.
was
No. Yeah, it was when I was living in LA.
mhm.
Yeah, I was yeah, just, like, deep in the deep in the US.
I
Yeah.
get it, I get it.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
the reason I ask is because I do believe that there is a huge correlation between where we are physically
Yeah.
and our mental space. So if we don't feel aligned with where we're living, of course, it's gonna cause things like feelings of anxiety, of course, depression, and
Mhm.
then they can go on and on and on. Hmm,
Agreed. Yeah, totally.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say, like, that's again, like, living in Tennessee for that 9 months, I just felt, like, a sense of calm in my spirit that I had not felt in so long that I think is part of living in LA, living in a city, living in close quarters, like, I
Mhm,
think I was really missing being around having access. California is beautiful, but I think, like, the way that I was able to access nature when I was in Tennessee was really different.
mhm.
Being alone in the woods, seeing wildlife, like, those aren't really things that happen when you're in a nature space in the city.
Yeah, yeah.
And living here as well, I also feel, and I know a lot of Black women that I know here feel that, like, there is a sort of weight lifted, there is a kind of freedom
Mhm.
just from not being in the US. Like, I don't wanna overstate it, but it does feel true to me.
Yeah.
Like, as I'm sure you know, like, stress causes inflammation. I used to have a lot of
Yes.
inflammation. I
Yes.
was dealing with high blood pressure. I'm still treated for that, but, like, those things have really shifted in my body.
Yeah.
My body looks totally different, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so 100%.
And even the things that you eat, right? I always think
Mhm.
about how whenever I leave the country for an extended amount of time, like, the food tastes different
Yes.
over there, like, way better,
Yeah.
and I can eat all day and I'm
Mm.
losing weight, and I come
Yeah.
here and, like, I'm packing on pounds for
Uh-huh.
nothing, and it's that
Yeah.
inflammation, and all of
Yeah.
that plays a role with, like, our mental well-being and everything.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah.
I, listened to your most recent episode of, Basket Case. First of all, I really love the sound design. It's very immersive, so
Yeah.
shout outs to you and the whole team who put that together. It's
Thank you.
beautifully done. So my question for you is what role can storytelling play in, reducing the stigma, around the mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that. I think that that was definitely something I was thinking about going into this project, really wanting to give, I was saying it was like it's by basket case for a basket case. Like I was like, I want to give people a platform to really tell their story and whatever their story means to them. Not speaking for every single person with that diagnosis,
Mhm,
but just like what specifically was going on with that person. Um, and so I know that for me, like even I had that experience of certain really stigmatized, like, I think the most stigmatized mental illness that we talked about was borderline personality disorder,
mhm,
and I learned so much from making that episode, and I do think it made me feel more empathic towards not only a couple people in my own life who have that
mhm.
diagnosis or who might have that diagnosis, but also just other people who are dealing with similar,
Yeah,
disabilities. I
yeah,
think the show makes me think a lot about disability and how prevalent it is, how many of
yes,
us are disabled, how disability isn't necessarily a permanent state, like you can become disabled tomorrow. And either of us
yes,
could.
yes, truly.
And I have identified that way at certain times in my life. So I like to think that, like telling these stories really frankly with a lot of, with a lot of sensitivity, but I don't really I try not to romanticize the stories. And I also, um, how should I put it? Like I'm not trying to be inspirational either.
Mhm.
I'm just sort of like, these stories are valid how they exist. The ugliness of life is interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
and
mostly
you're
for people
showing
pleasing was that. Oh, go ahead,
yeah,
sorry.
and you're showing the humanity,
Mhm,
of people experiencing different mental health, conditions because I think a
mhm.
lot of time we hear certain diagnoses and we instantly have so many thoughts about what that means, and
Right.
we think about maybe the symptoms or how they
Yeah.
present and not the
Mhm.
actual person who's experiencing it and their loved
Right.
ones who are also, in a way, experiencing this
Yeah.
too, right?
Mhm. Exactly.
So, yeah, so hearing, people's stories just helps us like, "Dang, like, that sounds like so and so that I know and I love."
Right.
Or, "Shoot, it sounds like me," you know?
Exactly,
Maybe I can,
exactly,
like, talk to somebody about that and see if I could, work through some of these things.
exactly.
Yeah.
I related to almost everyone I talked to, like, I found something to relate to with everyone that I spoke to, I
Of
think.
course. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things I think is really powerful and just beautiful about sharing our stories is that because we're all human, we all have very similar experiences. They might not be exactly the same, but if we listen to each other, we really can relate to each other
Mhm.
at some
Yeah.
level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Um, so how do you take care of your own mental health when you're talking, about really heavy topics?
Yeah. You know, it's funny is that I think one of the reasons I'm a good host of this show is because I do think, like, I am so in my head, like, I am someone who enjoys thinking through. I've had to learn to feel my feelings versus, like,
Mhm.
thinking my feelings.
Oh, goodness, I'm working on
Right, yeah.
it.
But, with that being said, I do feel like kind of like throwing myself into, like, an intellectual project is something that, I actually really enjoy and brings me a lot of pleasure.
Mhm,
I feel like, there's a couple of things that I always say, like, are the most important things in my life. One of them is pleasure. I'm always like, "Am I having fun?" If I'm not having
mhm,
fun, something's wrong. So, solving a problem creatively or kind of, like, learning about any of these topics is something that's fun for me, and so that actually does make me feel really grounded. Um, but, also, yeah, here, like, I've gotten really into, like, riding my bike, like, it's my number 1 mode of public transportation now, and
mhm.
so I bike a lot. Um, I have a neighbor here who does what's called temazcal ceremonies. I don't know if you've ever done that. They're like these like sweat lodges.
Mhm,
Yeah, so he is a temazcalero, so he hosts those once a month or so, and every couple of months I'll go. And so it's like just, it's one of my there's a couple of different communal experiences that I get to participate in here, and that's one of them. And that's a place where I feel like an immense amount of emotional safety and just
mhm,
sense of belonging, even though I don't always know the people there.
mhm.
So that's been really nice to get to do. Um,
Tell me
yeah.
more about the temazcal. So it's
Uh,
literally like you go and you
mhm.
sweat it out?
Yeah, so it's a pre-Columbian ceremony. It's
Mhm,
from, I guess, like, what is commonly called, like, the Aztec culture. I think, like, now that's not, like, the correct name. I feel like now I'm gonna get it wrong, but that's well, a lot of people know as, like, the Aztecs or whatever.
yes. Mhm,
Nahuatl is, like, the Aztec word for it. So it's a ceremony of that culture, that's
mhm,
from, like, this region of Mexico.
mhm,
It's a little low hut. I think they're sometimes made of clay, sometimes they're made of cement, and you heat up rocks in a fire for hours beforehand.
mhm,
And then there's sort of like a ceremonial bringing of the rocks into the space once
mhm.
they're heated. You call the rocks abuelas to kind of like
Oh,
recognize, like, yeah, the sort of ancestral veneration that's happening. And then once you're inside the lodge, you close the door and it's like totally dark inside. Maybe there's like 15 people inside. There's also like, you can go to certain parts of Mexico and do this like kind of sort of more spa experience where it's just like you and a friend covering
mhm,
yourself in clay and stuff. I've done that too. I also love that.
mhm,
But the more ceremonial ones are, with 15 people or so, people are singing. There's songs you sing to welcome the abuelas. Usually sort of, songs of gratitude as well. People usually sort of introduce themselves and say why they're there. And then there's water thrown on the rocks and herbs. The herbs are in the water, and that herbed water is thrown on the rocks and creates steam.
mhm,
And so where the ceremonies, there's 4 what they call 4 puertas that are kind of like for each direction,
mhm,
and each direction is sort of like related to a certain, god from that culture,
mhm,
and so each round is, like, progressively more intense, and so there's a little break in between. At one point, they give us, like, Jamaica tea to kinda calm down and chill out.
mhm,
But it's pretty intense, like, I wouldn't say it's relaxing,
mhm,
it feel like afterwards you kinda feel amazing, but
mhm.
it's like it can be really uncomfortable depending on who's doing it or whatever. Like, I've ended it in the fetal position, you know? Sometimes your eyes are burning, like, it's kind of physically intense, but I think that's, like, part of it. I always think it's, like, this metaphor where it's, like, about kind of like a mind over matter thing where you know that it's temporary, you know that you can stand it, you have to just sort of,
Mhm.
like, get through it,
Yeah,
and you can't leave, like, once you're in there, you're
that's
in
it.
there, so yeah, yeah.
It reminds me what it sounds like, is what I read about, like, ayahuasca ceremonies.
Mm,
Have you ever experienced an ayahuasca ceremony before?
I have not.
No? I'm
Mhm.
really, really curious about it,
Yeah.
but from what I understand, and if please correct me, anybody who's listening, if I'm wrong, but from what I
Uh-huh.
understand, you drink the ayahuasca tea, like, in this type of, like
Structure.
yeah, structure.
Mhm.
I think it's also heated. I don't know how hot it is, though.
Okay, okay.
Um, and then you drink the tea, and then the tea takes over.
Mhm.
And some people describe, like, it's very uncomfortable. I understand that some people, like, throw up during, and,
Mhm,
like, the
mhm,
people who are leading it are gonna, like, help you get cleaned up and everything, but, like,
mhm,
it's, like, all part of it to, like,
mhm.
then, I don't know, get more information from the spirits and everything. But
Yeah.
again, that the what sounds so similar is the fact that the discomfort that you sit in, but at the end of it, on the other side of it, you feel so much more. You feel better, you feel rejuvenated, you
Mhm.
feel clearer, and all of those things. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm curious and I want to do it, but I'm scared. I don't like to throw up. I don't. I don't like discomfort. If I'm being honest, like if I know I'm going to be uncomfortable, I'm just like, yeah, I will pass.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, it's funny because actually the last episode of Basket Case just came out was about the idea of ceremony, and I talk both about the temazcal, and I talked to an integrative psychiatrist in Mexico who leads people on mushrooms, kind of like
Hmm.
ceremonies,
Hmm.
guided. There's, like, obviously there's some, medical oversight happening. But yeah, but I got to talk about both, like, my interest in temazcal, the fact that I have, I've done not with a psychiatrist, but I have had really positive experiences doing mushrooms, and it's
Hmm.
kind of it is really similar. It's like there's, like,
Hmm.
this sort of purification purge that's happening.
Hmm.
Not maybe not as strong as the ayahuasca, it's more like I was crying a lot, but it's, like, definitely, like, things are coming out, you know?
Mhm,
And then
mhm,
kind of, like, I do feel like there's, like, you're in, like, your own psychic plane, and
mhm.
the first time I did it, I remember saying, I was like, "I feel like I just did, like, 3 years of therapy in, like, 12 hours," you know?
Wow,
The things that came up were that's actually what set me off on my healing journey was that experience. Like, the
wow.
things that came to the surface,
Mhm.
I was like, "Oh, okay, there's a lot of stuff here that now that I've seen this, now I have to deal with this," you know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Can we talk more about that? Because I'm
Mhm.
curious about that as well. Because in my mind, it seems like it would be like a dream like state maybe where you're
Mm.
receiving like clarity. How do you
Mm.
remember all the things to like, oh, I need to address this? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So again, like I'm referring to psilocybin to mushrooms. I've never done
Mhm,
ayahuasca, which I have also heard that it's kind of more of like a trance state, which
mhm,
feels maybe slightly different than what I remember.
mhm,
But I would say, yeah, like I've had these. So I've only had two experiences.
mhm,
Because I do think of them like the psychiatrist I spoke to. I do think of it as medicine, as something for healing. It's not really something I do like recreationally or like with friends or at a party or something.
right.
That was sort of how it was introduced to me, and so I've just have carried that.
Mhm,
But it's funny because, like, yeah, the first time what I remember is more the physical experience. I remember, like, how I was navigating the space. I remember like but I don't remember, like, what I was seeing. I don't really feel like I was having, like, hallucinations or anything. It was just more that, like I said, this feeling of, like, all this emotional things coming to the surface, almost like a gunk coming up. Um, I remember I tried to write something down. I kind of, like, physically wasn't able to.
wow.
But it's just like, you say, "How do you remember?" It was just like it's kinda like marks you, like, once I knew those things and also it's like, you're communing with yourself, so, like, once I knew the things I knew, once the things had been I think what I saw was I was thinking a lot about my younger self, I was thinking a
Mhm,
lot about things she had experienced. Yeah, I think it was the first time I feel like I had a relationship with that younger self.
mhm,
I was feeling a lot of grief, I think that, that's why I was crying, I was feeling, like, a lot of grief over just things that had
yeah,
happened that I think I had internalized as being somehow about me,
yeah,
as opposed to me being a Black girl living in the South, living in a really white community in the South,
yeah,
and things that were happening at that time.
yeah,
Or having the parents that I had, like, our parents do the best that they can do, but just like, the
of
ways that I
course.
was, let's say like emotionally neglected or just
Yeah,
like the violence that I experienced. Like, I don't think
yeah.
it's an overstatement to say the violence that we experience.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
especially, millennial children of, like, boomers, for
Thank
sure.
you.
Okay.
Talk about it. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, just and, like, and my divesting from people pleasing, a lot of that had to do with my relationship with my mom as well,
Mhm.
you know? So, like, all that I guess I'm just saying, like, all that stuff, it's like, it was already kind of in there, and so just, like, once I knew, it's almost like seeing a movie of your own life maybe,
Yeah,
you know? And then more
yeah.
recently, it was more dreamlike where I also had this it was so funny because it was the spring before my mom died, and, like, mostly a lot of the experience was me I closed my eyes and it did feel dreamlike where I was like in a space. My mom was there. My grandmother who had already passed, who had also had died young, she was there. And I was
Mhm,
watching the two of them interact in this way.
mhm.
And then my mom also died very suddenly. Like it wasn't really
Mm,
expected. She
yeah.
got a diagnosis and I think 4 months later she was gone. So
I'm so sorry.
I definitely didn't know that that was about to happen. But I do think it's interesting that I had that experience that time. It was way less about me and way more about them somehow.
Mm,
So
I
I think
see.
that's yeah, that's what the psychiatrist I interviewed was talking about. She was like, "I wanna get not only to the root of what you have experienced in your life, but all the things that you're carrying that weren't even yours," you know?
Yeah, that
The things
intergenerational stuff.
exactly, exactly, and
Yeah.
so for her, she says, like, "These are tools psychedelics are tools that help us to really address and heal on this, like, deep level,"
Mhm.
you know?
Incredible, incredible. So, one of the ways I typically like to wrap up the show is by
Mhm.
asking, what's been bringing you joy? But you told me what's bringing you joy. So, you said bike riding and
Yeah.
living among community and things. So, I'm going to ask you a different question.
Okay.
Um, are you reading anything right now? And if so, what is it that you're reading?
Yeah, I'm reading a book called Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman.
Ooh.
Yeah, it came out in 2015. Sarah Schulman is like an academic and also a creative writer, and this book is written more from she says that she's writing it from a queer point of view, from like a lesbian point of view,
Mhm.
and she's like writing it from outside of academia. But basically, it's just about the idea that conflict we should think of conflict as normal,
Yep.
and that we often don't, and that a lot of times conflict can feel like harm as a result of that.
Yep.
But we're talking about that book on basket case. I'm reading that because we're talking about on basket case, mental illness and accountability,
Ooh.
and sort of how to like be in community with each
Yes.
other while we're also dealing
Yes.
with so much.
Yes. You know
Yeah.
what's funny? My husband and I were just talking about this. Um, so we were talking about how our generation has like we lack community, really. Think
Mhm.
about when we were kids, like our parents would always get together or be there for people who they may not have always liked and would literally have beef with. Like there'd be conflict. Like
Right,
at the
right.
get together, like the aunties would go at it, like, I don't like you, or I don't like you did this, and this. Like they have the
Yeah.
conflict, but they still be in community. You can
Right,
count
yeah.
on them to show up for each other. And our
Right.
generation has been so afraid of conflict and conflict avoidant that we don't know how to do community properly. And to your
Mhm.
point, whenever there
Mhm.
is conflict, we think, oh, that's abusive or whatever.
Right, yeah. I
That's
avoid
a
it.
right, right, right. That
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
That too. And a lot of us now, because our eyes are opening that we absolutely need each other and we need community. Now we're
Yeah.
just like, I don't even know how to do this community thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. I think that's something else that's come up so much in the show that that's like my next writing project is I wanna really write through, thinking about being what does it mean to be a bad friend? How do we learn the skills to do conflict?
Yep.
How do you, yeah, not throw people away or throw relationships away? Yeah,
Yeah.
I really feel
Ooh.
that as well. Mhm.
Yeah. I love that. I'm looking forward to your project. And I'm definitely gonna take a look at
We
that
need
book
it.
as well. Yes.
Oh, yeah, check it out.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much for your time, NK. Where can the people find you online and all of those good things? How can we support?
You can follow me, you can lurk me on Instagram at soft__disaster,
Mhm.
yeah, or at fknk.com
Okay.
for my various projects.
Okay, awesome. And then I'll also link a basket case down below. That way they can go
Right.
listen, follow all of those good things. I
Yeah,
got
it's
you.
available wherever you get your podcast. Thank you.
Yes. Got you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Be Well Sis. If you'd like to get in touch with us, there's a link in the show notes. Be Well Sis is hosted by me, Dr. Cassandra Dunbar, and produced by Edit Audio. Don't forget to hit follow so you never miss an episode. Until next time, be well, sis.